And with that, I am proud to introduce Tom Keating for the New York You Didn't Know presentation. Tom has been an educator for 32 years, fortunate to work with students from elementary to high school as both a teacher and counselor. As a volunteer for a Big Apple Greater, he's also guided numerous tourists around New York City. Tom is the curator of a seasonal gallery run by the Friends of Historic Hewlett's Landing on Lake George, and has been giving talks about New York for the past 4 years at various venues in New York and New Jersey. I am fortunate that I was able to get a quick presentation of this earlier this week, and I think you're all in for a treat. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Tom so we can begin his presentation.
Thank you, and welcome to the New York You Don't Know. I am going to be showing you a number of places that you really do know, but you're probably not too familiar with how they got started. And I'll also introduce you to some places you probably never even heard of. And we'll start the tour with this building, one of New York's most famous buildings, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as it stands on Fifth Avenue. It's a rather grand structure, but it wasn't always quite so grand. This is how the Met looked in the 1870s when it was located on 14th Street. And even before it was on 14th Street, it spent a few years in a former dance academy on Fifth Avenue and 54th Street. Well, during the 1870s, the city government decided that the Met should have its own building. And so they came up with a plan to locate the Met in the newly opened Central Park. And you can see the diagram there in the park around the lower 80s. And so the first building to open for the new Met was this building. It opened in 1880. It was designed by Calvert Vaux and Jacob Ray Mould, two of the three people who are most responsible for the creation of Central Park, which I'll tell you about later in the program. You will notice that the sides of this building are rather plain, and that's because they knew ahead of time that they would be building additions onto this building. And so they started to do that shortly after it opened. These two wings, called Wing B and Wing C, opened in 1888, and then the other one in 1894. And when you are in the museum today and you are in the sculpture hall and you're looking at the wall, that is actually the facade of one of the original buildings. So as the years went by, additions continued to be put onto the building. And in 1902, the front entrance on Fifth Avenue was added. Previous to this, the entrance to the museum was through the park. This building was designed by Richard Morris Hunt. He was one of the most distinguished architects at that time. He was noted for designing quite a few of the mansions that lined Fifth Avenue. He also has a monument to his work that is located in the Central Park wall that runs along Fifth Avenue. Shortly after that one, we come to the rest of the Fifth Avenue facade, which was added between 1907 and 1926. These additions to the building were designed by the architectural firm called McKim, Mead and White, the foremost architectural firm of its time. They designed 29 different buildings in New York City alone, and most notably the original Penn Station and the main post office on 8th Avenue. So the additions continued to come on, and then the museum, as we know it today, has ended up looking like this. And at this point, they are prohibited from going any further into the park. So if they want to expand, they're going to have to go up. And here's a very interesting diagram that shows you how all the wings were added and what year they were added. And you'll notice that the later wings have names, and that's because those were the benefactors of the people who contributed for those wings. So here are some of the things you can see at the Met. One is the Temple of Den-Dur. It was a gift to New York from the government of Egypt This temple was going to be inundated by the waters behind the Aswan Dam. What I like about this installation is that windowed wall behind it, so that the installation is always bathed in natural light, which of course adds to its fascination. You can also see The Harvesters by Peter Bruegel from 1565. You can see Camille Monet, painted by her husband Claude from 1873. And Snap the Whip by Winslow Homer from 1872. These two hotels came about as a result of a feud within the Astor family, one of the wealthiest families in New York at the time. William Waldorf Astor built the Waldorf Hotel right next to the mansion of his Aunt Caroline. Well, Aunt Caroline did not take too kindly to that idea, and so a feud developed, and her son, John Jacob Astor, decided to get even with his cousin, and he built the Astoria Hotel, an even larger building, right next to the Waldorf. Well, eventually they solved their feud, and the hotels were merged into what we call the Waldorf Astoria. So this, at the time, was the biggest hotel in the world. It occupied a full block along Fifth Avenue. It was world renowned for its luxurious amenities. And so it functioned from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. But in 1929, it had to be torn down because an even bigger building was going to be built on this plot. It's called the Empire State Building. So the Waldorf was forced to move uptown to this location at Park Avenue and 50th Street. And this building was designed by Schultz and Weaver. It opened in 1931, and it was designed in the Art Deco style. Now, Art Deco was all the rage in the 20s and 30s in New York. And indeed, the three tallest buildings in 1930s New York are all done in Art Deco. And they are the Empire State, the Chrysler Building, and what was originally called the RCA Building in Rockefeller Center. So one of the interesting things about this Waldorf is that it's built right over the tracks that lead to Grand Central, and it actually has its own railroad siding, so that when Franklin Roosevelt came to town, he could have his railway coach parked right under the hotel, giving him easy access to the hotel. And of course, over the years, many famous people stayed here, and some famous people even lived here, like Cole Porter and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. There you see the famous Waldorf salad. I do not know the architect of the salad. And this is the Waldorf as it appears now. It has been closed for the past few years because it is being refurbished and turned into condos, and it's scheduled to reopen in 2022. This is a split picture that shows you the building that we know as Castle Clinton. Well, when that building was originally constructed, it was constructed as a fort out into the river, and that happened in 1811. And the fort was called the West Battery. And you will notice that the current building is not in the river. That's because it has been subjected to landfill. And in fact, much of southern Manhattan is landfill. So over the years, this building became used in different ways. So there you see it as a fort for which it was originally built. And then later it became a performing arts center, and the name was changed to Castle Clinton. So it was a performing arts center starting in 1821, and that lasted until 1896. Here's what it looked like on the inside. Quite a grand concert hall, probably give Carnegie Hall a run for its money. After it stopped being a concert hall, it was transformed into the New York Aquarium, and it served as that purpose from 1896 to 1941. And then it became a national monument in 1950. and is currently used as it's a really interesting museum about Lower New York. And it also serves as the ticket booth for the trips to the Statue of Liberty. And I just recently found out that they are still running trips to the Statue of Liberty. However, you cannot go into the statue. You can just take a trip to Liberty Island. It's quite a fascinating museum. It's all about Lower New York. If you're in the neighborhood, I would stop in and take a glance. Now, walking just a few blocks from that location to Lower Broadway, we come to the Cunard Building, which was opened in 1921. Now, the Cunard steamship line was the first steamship line to start regularly scheduled transatlantic service. And they started that way back in 1840. And 180 years later, they're still offering transatlantic service. So the Cunard line had this building constructed in the 1920s, and you'll notice that the name is carved into the concrete, which was a common habit at that time. And even though the Cunard Company left this building back in the 60s, it's still referred to as the Cunard Building. And one of the reasons why they constructed this building was because they wanted to have a ticket office there. And this was the grand hall that served as a ticket office. And as you can see, it certainly is rather splendid and grand. It has frescoes on the wall with a maritime theme, and all the pictures around it are having maritime themes. Walk a few more blocks from the Cunard Building, and you're going to come to this unusual building. Some people call this the Stegosaurus Building, but it's really the Path Center. It's called the Oculus. And what happened with this building is certainly the most unusual building in New York. But when the World Trade Center attacks came in 2001, and after that, there was not only a lot of physical destruction, but there was a lot of economic destruction to Lower New York. And so a mindset took hold that said, do whatever it takes to revive that area. So this building is that mindset sort of being carried to the extreme, because this building ended up costing close to $4 billion. And it's really a railroad station. It serves the PATH system, which runs trains over to New Jersey. But no one thinks of it too much as a rail station because it's mainly a shopping center. So this is what it looks like on the inside. It's rather stark and grand looking. It has 2 floors of stores. And I wanted to say also that this building was designed by Santiago Calatrava. And one of the things I thought about this building is that if this was building on an open field, it would have a much more dramatic effect. But instead, it had to be crammed into this narrow space next to some other buildings. But there it is, nevertheless. This is the New York Marble Cemetery, which is located at 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street. This cemetery is the oldest public non-sectarian cemetery in New York City. It was opened in 1830, and most of the people who are buried in here were buried between 1830 and 1870. And you will notice that there are no typical cemetery stones on the grounds. That's because all the markers are in the wall that surrounds the cemetery, and the vaults are underground, and that's where the people are buried. So this is open on a limited basis. I happen to go there during the day that's called Open House New York. It's a weekend in October. It's usually the 2nd or 3rd weekend. And they open up all kinds of places in New York that you don't usually get to see. So this is one of them. And so next, it just so happens that Open House New York just happened last weekend, so you just missed it. But they do it every October. Look for it on its website. and you'll find a lot of interesting places to go and visit. This is a art installation called The Broken Kilometer. It is at 393 West Broadway. It is managed by the Dia Art Foundation, and it has been here since 1979. The Broken Kilometer was designed by Walter de Maria, and it is open most days of the week from about noon to 5 p.m. So you can go in there and contemplate it. I go in there every time I'm in this area because I find it rather fascinating. And I also, whenever I have visitors that I'm taking around that area, I'm sure to bring them inside and take a look at this. Once again, it's at 393 West Broadway, and it's called The Broken Kilometer. It consists of 500 brass rods that are spaced so they look differently as they go to the back. This is the Polo Grounds when it was first built. And when the Polo Grounds was first built, they actually played polo there. This was built at 5th Avenue and 110th Street in 1876. Now, the Polo Grounds has gone through several incarnations over the years. So after a certain period of time, as the city developed farther and farther north, the Polo Grounds had to move to a new location. So they moved up further uptown to around 155th Street to the area that was known as Coogan's Bluff. And here you see one of the first incarnations of the stadium where they actually started to play baseball. This stadium was working from 1890 to 1911 when it burned down. Then they replaced the stadium with an even bigger one that those of you who are old enough might remember, the Polo Grounds. The Polo Grounds was the home of the New York Giants, both the baseball and football team, and even the Yankees played here for a period of time. And in its final 2 years, it became the home of the newly created New York Mets. So the Mets were here because Shea Stadium hadn't been built yet. So they played here in 1962 and 1963. And at that time, you may remember the Mets as being rather hapless. And so Jimmy Breslin wrote this book called Can't Anybody Here Play This Game? And that, of course, is a quote from the manager of the Mets, Casey Stengel. One of the buildings that overlooks the Polo Grounds, you might have noticed it up on that cliff behind it, is this building, which is called the Morris Jemele Mansion. This is the oldest house in Manhattan. It was built in 1765 for a British officer by the name of Roger Morris. And the unique thing about this house is that it served as a headquarters for both the American Revolution and for the British. So George Washington happened to know somebody who had lived in this house, and George Washington used it as his headquarters for a period of time before the Americans had to vacate Manhattan Island altogether. And then it was taken over by the British, and it became their headquarters. It's done in the federal style, and this is what it looks like on the inside. It's now a museum. So you can go there, and if it's open these days, I'm not quite sure, and it's been preserved as it looked in the 1760s. Subsequent to Roger Morris living in this house, it was taken over by Stephen Jemele. That's why it's called the Morris Jemele Mansion. And Stephen lived in it till he died, and then his wife, Eliza Jemele, as a widower, married Aaron Burr, and they lived in this house also. Here's the answer to one of the questions that I proposed. How many Madison Square Gardens have there been? Well, this is the first Madison Square Garden, and the reason why it's called Madison Square Garden is because it was actually built at Madison Square. So this first one opened in 1879 and served through 1890, but it had no roof, so it couldn't be used in the wintertime. So it was torn down, and in 1890, they built another Madison Square Garden at the same location. This was designed by the architect Stanford White, and at the time, it was the second tallest building in New York. And this served its purpose from 1890 to 1925. But it also was a money loser, and so they moved the Madison Square Garden uptown to 8th Avenue and 50th Street. And those of you who are old enough might have gone to this version of Madison Square Garden. It's where the circus used to perform, and also the dog show, as you can see. And this Madison Square Garden was designed by Thomas Lamb, and it was in effect operation from 1925 to 1968, when the current Madison Square Garden opened on the former site of Penn Station. Madison Square Garden has a set of electric trains in the basement, and it is called Penn Station. This is the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It is located at 89th Street and Riverside Drive. It opened in 1902. It commemorates the Union Army and the Union Navy. For some reason, it took them 37 years to get around to commemorating that. But at the time, they held a public competition to design the building. It was won by the architects Charles and Arthur Stoughton. And you'll notice that it has 12 marble columns that surround it. And it was inspired by Greek antiquity, and you see that they are Corinthian columns. And this became a landmark in 1976. Another memorial that is not quite as well known. In fact, I never heard of it until I started doing research for this program. This is the Titanic Memorial. And it's currently located in the Seaport at Fulton and Pearl Streets. But when it was originally built, it was put on top of the Seamen's Church Institute, which is at the tip of Manhattan Island. And you'll notice that it has a ball up at the top. So when it was at the tip of Manhattan Island, that ball would come down every day at noontime as a signal to all the ships in the harbor. Now, noontime on a ship is very important because that's when the day starts for the ship's log. So in 1968, the monument was moved to the seaport, and there it stands today. I have walked by that a number of times, and I never even noticed it. Perhaps you have. Here we have the High Line, when it really was a line. A railroad was built on the Lower West Side of New York in 1847. It was built to serve the freight warehouses in that particular area. And as the years went by and traffic on the street got heavier and heavier, they decided to elevate the tracks. And so in 1934, they built this elevated railway. And so that served the city until 1980, when the train stopped running, and it ended up looking like this. And it looked like that for about 20 years. And then around the late 90s, the city got anxious about it and started talking about tearing it down. At the same time, a group of private citizens got together and said, no, 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 let's not tear it down. Let's make a park. And so they were able to raise the money to turn this meadow into a park that we have come to know as the High Line. So the Friends of the High Line is the organization that's responsible for bringing this into existence. And there you see another picture of it. The High Line was opened in 3 stages. The first was opened in 2009, the second in 2011, and the last one in 2014. Well, nobody could begin to imagine the real estate boom that this sightseeing attraction has set off. This area was essentially not too populated before this line was built. It was mainly an area of warehouses and art museums in Chelsea. And there were a few apartment buildings located within this area also. But all of a sudden, there was a great building boom. And so apartment buildings went up, hotels went up, stores went up, everything imaginable. And so the High Line has actually become the most popular sightseeing attraction in New York. And it's almost a victim of its own success, because there's certain days when it's so crowded, it almost looks like a cattle drive. But it's certainly one of the, of course, one of the unique things about the High Line is that it's up above street level. So you get these unique viewpoints all along it. It's really a pleasure to walk it. Try to walk it when there's not so many people around. This is one of New York's famous bookstores. It is probably one of the few remaining bookstores, since they are going out of business left and right. But the Strand Bookstore was originally on 4th Avenue, which was known as Book Row in the 1920s. And in Book Row, there are actually 48 bookstores in just that one neighborhood. And it was built by or owned by Benjamin Bass at that time. Well, in 1956, his son, Fred Bass, took over, and he moved the store to where it's currently located, Broadway and 12th Street. It's been a family-owned business. It has 18 miles of books, approximately 2.5 million books, and it looks like this on the inside. It's a pleasure to go in there and just browse. It has 4 floors of both used books and new books, and a book lover can really get lost in there and have a great time. This is the 7th Regiment Armory. It's at Park Avenue and 67th Street. It is one of the 2 remaining armories in the United States that was built with private funds. It has very detailed rooms. It has ornamental woodwork. It has marble. It has stained glass. And it even has a library that was designed by Louis Tiffany. The unique thing about this armory is that today it is used as a performing arts space. It has this really gigantic space in the middle of it, and it's great to go and see a show there. For one show, they had filled the floor with water. They built a pool, and the show itself took place in the pool. So, and I don't know if they're having shows now during the COVID time, but when it does reopen, I would urge you to go and see this space, because it's quite fascinating. I went in there and just wandered around. So at that time, it happened to be open. You could just go in and look at it. This is the first subway station in New York City. It was built for the IRT line, which opened in 1904. The IRT line started at City Hall, and it ran up the west side to about 140th Street. And that line opened in 1904. And this was designed to be the showpiece of the subway system. This was how the actual station looked. It had Guastavino tiles, it had skylights, it had brass chandeliers, and it was designed in the Romanesque revival style by Raphael Guastavino. Now, you'll notice that the station was built on a curve, and it could only handle 5-car trains. So as the trains got longer, they had to close this station, and it's not used anymore. But it's still there. And if you stay on the number 6 train, when it gets to its final station at Brooklyn Bridge, and you hide out from the conductor, you can ride the train through this station and see what it looks like. And if you don't want to commit a crime, you can go look at the station when the Transit Museum runs a tour of it. But it's just a beautiful station, and it just outshines all the other stations in the system. But we do have the newest subway station that is on the 2nd Avenue subway line. And this subway line had the longest gestation period of any subway line in the history of the world. The idea was originally planned in 1919. And as the years went by, there used to be a Second Avenue L and a Third Avenue L. Both of them were torn down in the 40s and 50s because they anticipated the building of the Second Avenue subway. Well, of course, it was nowhere near getting built at that time. Finally, in 1972, they started to dig a tunnel for the Second Avenue subway. But unfortunately, the 1975 fiscal crisis loomed its ugly head, and there was no more money for finishing the subway. So it lied idle until 2007, when work was resumed on the Second Avenue subway. And this time they could actually bring it to at least somewhat semi-fruition because it only has 3 stations. But they did complete the 3 stations. They are at 72nd Street, 86th Street, and 96th Street. And the way you get there is you can take the Q train from Midtown and ride it up to the Upper East Side. And as you can see, the station itself, these stations are rather dazzling. They're very colorful. They have murals carved into the tile walls. And so if you have a chance, just take a ride up there to see them. They also, let's go back one. They're built on 2 levels. So every station has a mezzanine, and then it has the escalator that goes down to the actual tracks. So this is what the planned Second Avenue subway is going to look like if it ever gets finished. Right now, they are working on the northern end, starting at 96th Street and going up to 125th Street. I have not been able to learn any completion date for that part. And of course, as you see on this map, it's supposed to go all the way downtown. Perhaps your great-grandchildren will get to ride it in its entirety. This is one of the most important persons in the New York art world of the 20th century. Does anybody know who she is? How about now? That is Abby Rockefeller and her husband, John D. Jr. In 1929, Abby Rockefeller got together with a couple of her friends and decided to create the Museum of Modern Art. And so she did. And the first location for the works of art was in an office building at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. At the time, it was known as the Heckscher Building. Today, it's called the Crown Building. It was on the 12th floor. And over the next 10 years, the Museum of Modern Art moved to 3 other office buildings before it finally got its own building on 53rd Street. Now, John D. was not a famous person who was in favor of modern art, but he did donate the land for the museum because he wanted to encourage his wife's project. So the first Museum of Modern Art opened on 53rd Street in 1939. And as the years went by, the museum got bigger and bigger. In the early 2000s, it closed up for 2 years to have an extensive building renovation made and an addition onto it. And the floor area almost doubled with this new addition. The new addition was designed by Yashio Taniguchi, and it nearly doubled the space. As I said, the museum was closed for 2 years and it reopened in 2004. Some of the early shows that they had at the museum were of Picasso and Van Gogh. You will notice also that on the left side of the picture, there is an empty lot. Well, the museum owned that lot and they sold it to a developer with the proviso that they could have floor space in the new building. And so this building, called the Heinz Building at 53 West 53rd Street, designed by Jean Nouvel, opened in 2019, and the museum took up a certain amount of floor space in this building. And so the museum is now, of course, larger than it has ever been. Unfortunately, it had to close shortly after it expanded because of the COVID, but I believe the museum is now open on a limited basis. So here's some of the things you can see at the Museum of Modern Art. This is the sculpture garden that is located in the back of the building on 54th Street. This is a painting known as F-111 by James Rosenquist. You can see how large some of the galleries are to be able to handle a picture this large. We also have The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh from 1889. We have Henri Rousseau's The Dream from 1910. Claude Monet, Reflections of Clouds in a Water Lily Pad from 1920. Henri Matisse, The Dance from 1909. And Georges Braque, Man with a Guitar from 1911. Sticking with the Rockefellers, this, we all know, is the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. It had rather humble beginnings. It started when Rockefeller Center was being built, and the workmen chose to put up a tree to celebrate Christmas. So once the Rockefellers saw that, they decided to make it an annual tradition. And so now we have the tree every year. And sticking with the Rockefellers, they built Rockefeller Center in the 1930s, which in some architects' eyes, it is regarded as the best building of its time. There are 14 original Art Deco buildings, and there are 5 international style buildings. And you'll notice that they are of different heights, and that's what lets in a lot of light. So it's not totally in shadows. So you're looking at what was originally called the RCA building. It's now simply called 30 Rock. It's mainly an entertainment complex. It's used for radio, TV, and movies. Here's one of the famous theaters in New York, Radio City. It has a seating capacity of almost 6,000 people. It showed movies and a live show for many, many years. You could see both for the one admission ticket. So it was a real bargain. Unfortunately, they stopped showing movies in the 1970s, and now the theater is only used for live performances. This is the ice skating rink with Prometheus overseeing the action. This is the Isaac Hendricks house. It's located in Greenwich Village at 77 Bedford Street. It was built in 1799 for a man named Jacob Isaac. It's time when it was built, it was actually a day's ride from where most of the city was located, which was at the tip of the island. So it was actually a country house. Mr. Isaacs lost the house eventually because of bankruptcy, and it was taken over by Harmon Hendricks. And he added various additions. He added the dormer at the top. He added the brick facade in the front. And you'll see on the side, it has bricks because that's where the fireplaces are. Here's another person. Can you identify who this person is? She is also one of the most important people in New York City in the 20th century art world. This is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. And she had amassed a collection of American art in the early part of the 20th century. And she went to the Met and she asked them if they would be interested in her art collection. Well, the Met turned up its collective nose and said, no, thank you. And the reason why they did that is because at that time, the Met was only interested in European art. So Miss Whitney said, the hell with you, I'll make my own museum. And so she did. It's called the Whitney Museum of American Art. And this is where its first location was, on West 8th Street in Greenwich Village. It later moved slightly uptown to near where MoMA was located. And then eventually in 1966, it got its own building at Madison Avenue and 75th Street. This building was designed by Marcel Breuer. in what was called the brutalist style. Some people thought it was just plain brutal, but nevertheless, it had a successful run into the 21st century. But as the art collection increased, the museum petitioned the city a number of times to increase its area and make additions to this building, but every proposal was rejected. And so the museum had to change its location. But as an anecdote about what goes around comes around, the Met didn't want her art collection, but they certainly wanted her building. So in 2016, the Metropolitan Museum took a lease on this building to show its collection of modern art. Unfortunately, the Met had to close up the building when the COVID problem started earlier this year. But now the building is being used to house the Frick collection, because the Frick Museum is being refurbished over the next 2 years. So if you want to see the Frick collection, you can go to this building on Madison Avenue. And you may actually see more of the Frick collection because this building is a lot bigger than the Frick Museum. So the Whitney packed up its art and moved to Greenwich Village, to this location at the foot of the High Line. So an area that was already extremely popular became even more popular, and attendance records were set during the first few years that the museum opened. They got many more people than they ever possibly could anticipate. And so it was a big success. What I like about this building is that on the east side, there are a number of outdoor terraces that are used to display sculpture, but you also get great views of the city from those outdoor terraces. And on the west side, there are gigantic windows that look out at the Hudson River, so you can get great views of the river. And between those two locations, you're probably going to find some art that will interest you. And here's some of it. This is the Black Head by Edward Hopper from 1916. This is Armistice Night by George Lukes from 1918. And this is Dempsey and Firpo by George Bellows from 1924. And if you haven't made note already, I will point it out to you that 2 of the 3 major museums in New York were founded by women: Abby Rockefeller with MoMA and Gertrude Whitney with the Whitney. This is the famous poet from the 19th century known as William Cullen Bryant. You'll notice what a clean shave he had at this time, but he ended up looking like this. And this is the picture that is most often portrayed of William Cullen Bryant with a full beard. Well, William Cullen Bryant was one of the most influential New Yorkers of the 19th century. Not only was he a famous poet, but he was a great newspaper man. He was both the editor and publisher of the Evening Post, which was the paper that was originally founded by Alexander Hamilton. Now, he used the Evening Post to advocate some of his positions. He was a great believer in Romanticism. And one of the tenets of Romanticism was that man needs nature. So Mr. Bryant advocated for the building of Central Park, because at the time in the mid-19th century, New York was a very violent city. If you ever saw the movie Gangs of New York, you have an idea how violent it was. So of course the city government was concerned about that, and they wanted to find a way to try and quell the violence. And so they thought one of the ways we could do that was to bring nature into the city. And that was what William Cullen Bryant was advocating for in his paper. Unfortunately, this paper evolved into this paper that we know as the New York Post, and came up with gory headlines such as you see here. So they gave Mr. Bryant his own park because he was such an outstanding citizen. It's Bryant Park, of course, is located right smack dab in Midtown, just behind the main library. And there already was a park there, but they changed the name of it to honor Mr. Bryant in 1884. And you can see it's a very nice piece of greenery in the middle of Midtown. Unfortunately, in the 70s and 80s, it fell into disrepair and it got all overgrown and it became known as an area for drug dealers. But in 1988, the park was refurbished, reopened in 1992, and it is currently run by the Bryant Park Corporation. And as you can see, people enjoy it very much on their lunch times, going out for some fresh air. And during the fall and spring, it is the location of the fashion show. And also at Christmas time, it's turned into a Christmas bazaar. This is Mr. Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted, one of the most important people in the development of New York. He was originally a journalist before he became a landscape architect. He, along with two other fellows by the name of Calvert Vaux, who was a landscape architect, and Jacob Ray Mold, who was also an architect, were the three main people most responsible for the design of Central Park. So in 1858, the city ran a competition to design the park. They got about 30 entries, and the winning entry was the one that was designed by Olmsted and Vaux. And it's thought that one of the reasons that it won is because it was the only design that allowed for crosstown traffic. If you didn't have the viaducts that go through the park, the traffic would have to drive all around the park. So they were clever enough to come up with this idea to sink the crosstown viaducts below the level of the park so that they didn't interfere with the park scenery. So at 66th Street, 79th Street, 86th Street, and 96th Street, you have the crosstown road so you can get from one side of town to the other. So the park opened in stages starting around 1860. And here you see the part of the park that is known as the mall. This is one of the few areas in the park that is actually designed on purpose to look like it's constructed. All the rest of the park is left to be natural. And even though it's natural, it's all designed to natural. It's not the natural land it's the natural land that was there before, but they came up with the idea of how the park should look and let it be natural. So there are a number of pathways through the park. There are pedestrian paths, there are bridle paths, and there are roadways for car traffic. So the park is also the home to many of these bridges. No two bridges are the same. They were all designed by not by Frederick Lowe, but by the two men that I mentioned just before. So this is one of them, and you'll see these all over the park. It was, this is the Swedish Cottage, the home of the Marionette Theater. This is the Sheep Meadow. It used to be the home of sheep, but Robert Moses, who became the park commissioner in the 1930s, he didn't like having sheep in the park, and so he shipped the sheep out to Long Island. But the meadow is still known as the Sheep Meadow. This is one of the lovely bridges, and in the background, you can see some of the famous buildings on the west side of Manhattan that line Central Park West. This is the dairy. The dairy was originally used to serve fresh milk to children in the 19th century. However, today it is used as a visitor center. Another one of the bridges. This is the Gapstow Bridge, which is made out of stone. This is the Bethesda Fountain, which was designed by Emma Stebbins in 1873. And this is the Minton tile at the Bethesda Fountain. This was created in the 1860s. It's made up of 49 panels with 16,000 elaborately paneled tiles that were designed by the English company called Minton. And this was designed by Jacob Ray Mould. And of course, in the 1980s, when the city was suffering a lot of deterioration, this structure also was in danger. So they dismantled the whole thing and put it into storage. But luckily, they brought it back in 2007. It is there for your viewing pleasure. And as you can see, the Bethesda Fountain is right in back of it, and the Bethesda Terrace is on the top of it. So thank you for coming to the New York You Don't Know. And that's the conclusion of my talk. Thank you so much.
Outstanding, Tom. Thank you so very much. I'm going to make a couple of announcements of upcoming events. If anyone has a question, now is the time to type it into the Q&A so we can ask Tom before we finish the program. I wanted to alert all of our members to a couple of continuing education opportunities that are coming up. One is on October 27th and 28th, sponsored by Architectural Record. If you go to Architectural Record's website, you can register for free for a 2-day innovation conference. Speakers are local as well as internationally renowned, so a really impressive lineup of speakers. You can earn up to 11.5 continuing education credits, some of them being HSW. So I encourage you to go to the Architectural Record website and register for this event. It's next week on Tuesday and Wednesday, so please register quickly. Number two, I would like to alert you to the AIA New Jersey Post-Pandemic Design webinar series. We have 5 programs that are scheduled, each focusing on a different sector of commercial design. The next one coming up is on Thursday, November 5th, and our panel includes our own Ben Lee, as well as Donna Terzano and Hollis Madera. So please join us. Those also are free, and each one will yield 1 continuing education credit, and the topics will include healthcare, retail restaurant, school and daycare, and contract interiors. Today we had our multifamily residential program. So let's see what we have here for questions. Congratulations and thanks to Tom for a great program.
You're welcome.
Great tour. I'm from New York City and learned a number of things. This was really great. Enjoyed your presentation. So we didn't have any questions, Tom, but a lot of appreciation. Oh, here's one question from D. Willett. Out of the buildings shown, which might have been the most complex?
The most complex?
Yes.
That's the PATH station.
The PATH
The
station.
one that Santiago Calatrava designed as part of the World Trade Center area.
Excellent. Okay, and one administrative question, how do you get credits for AIA? You got your credits by registering for this program. So at the completion of the program, you're going to receive a survey tomorrow. You answer the questions in the survey, and if our records indicate that you stayed on the program for the full amount of time, then everyone will receive credit who falls into that category. Another question here, when Madison Square Garden's current lease expires, will Penn Station be rebuilt?
Well, Madison Square Garden has been given sort of a 10-year lease or leash, if you want to think of it that way, when they can come up with another plan. They've been asked to move, but the owners have refused to move. So that's why they're staying where they are. You know, they were given the opportunity to move over to where the Hudson Yards are now, the shopping center that just recently opened.
Right.
But they didn't take up that idea, and they're staying put rather stubbornly. In the meantime, they're turning the post office into Penn Station. You know, the main post office across from Penn Station.
Right. All right. Well, Tom has some additional tours. Hopefully we'll be hearing from him again in 2021. Thank you all for being on the meeting tonight, and I hope everyone stays healthy and safe through the winter and joins us for our future webinars. Have a great night, everybody.